I heard my son shouting in the kitchen, "He's my friend, Mom. You're crazy." I rushed in, and in that moment my world fell apart. His phone was lying on the table, open to his messages, dozens of messages, photos, and the words "I love you." But they weren't addressed to my son, they were addressed to my wife. He was only 16. My wife was 36. I always thought my marriage was stable. Not perfect. We had our share of arguments about money, parenting, and stupid little things like who forgot to buy milk, but stable. We'd been together for almost 15 years, married for 12. And we had a 16-year-old son, Dylan, who I considered my best achievement in life. I thought my wife, Claire, and I were raising him well. I thought we were a team, but the first cracks showed in ways I didn't pay enough attention to. Claire became weirdly protective of Dylan. At first, I thought it was just the usual mother-hen thing. She would argue with me if I grounded him for bad grades. She'd grab his phone from me if I asked to check it after he'd been caught lying. She even got angry when I told Dylan to come shoot hoops with me instead of spending all day in his room gaming. She'd say things like, "He needs his space, stop smothering him," or "You're being too hard on him, he's just a kid." At the time, it felt like the classic parenting tug-of-war, the stricter dad, the softer mom. But the more I noticed it, the stranger it felt. She wasn't just protecting Dylan from me, she was inserting herself into his private life, asking him about his friends, about what they talked about who he texted. And not in a normal mom way. It was almost obsessive. There were nights when I'd go to bed and realize she wasn't there. I'd find her sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, tense and jumpy. If I asked what she was doing, she'd snap at me, "Just leave it, I can't sleep." I thought maybe she was depressed. Maybe she was hiding something. I even started to wonder if she was cheating. There were too many little signs: the late-night texting, the secrecy with her phone, her sudden over-interest in working out and buying new clothes. Once, when I half-joked, "Who are you dressing up for?" she looked at me like I'd accused her of murder, but the worst part was how Dylan acted. He was a good kid, a little quiet, but lately he seemed confused around me. Like he didn't know whether to side with me or his mom. Sometimes he'd get moody and snap at me out of nowhere. Once, when I told him to stop swearing at me, Claire physically stepped between us, like she thought I was going to hit him. I've never laid a hand on my son, not once in my life. That moment stung so badly I couldn't even look at her, and then came that night that I heard Dylan's voice first. A yell from the kitchen, sharp and broken. "He's my friend, Mom. You're insane." I froze in the hallway. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that Dylan had gotten into trouble. Maybe drunk, maybe caught stealing, something huge. I ran to the kitchen. What I saw didn't make sense at first. Dylan's phone was lying open on the table. Claire was standing there, pale and furious, trying to grab it, but Dylan had shoved her hand away. His eyes were wet with tears. I looked down at the phone. My brain didn't register the words for a second. Dozens of messages, little hearts, selfies, late-night texts. I thought maybe Dylan had a girlfriend. But then I read the name. The words, "I love you. Wish you were here in my bed. You're the only one who understands me." They weren't from Dylan. They were from his best friend. And they weren't to Dylan. They were to Claire.in. That second, everything shattered. My knees nearly gave out. Dylan screamed again, voice cracking. "He's 16, Mom. What the hell is wrong with you?" Claire's face went white, then red, then back to white. She opened her mouth like she wanted to explain, but nothing came out. My son was crying, shouting, but all I could hear was a buzzing in my head, a sickening mix of rage and disbelief. My wife, the woman I trusted, the mother of my son, was having an affair. Not with some coworker. Not with a stranger, with my son's best friend. I don't remember what I said in those first moments. Maybe I didn't say anything at all. My body was moving, my hands were trembling, but my mind was stuck, like an old computer that suddenly freezes and won't load the next screen. All I could see were those messages glowing on the phone. Every word, every picture, a direct attack on the reality I thought I lived in. It's one thing to imagine your partner cheating. People talk about that all the time, and it's almost cliché. You picture secret meetings at hotels, or someone sneaking out during lunch breaks. Ugly, but ordinary. What I was looking at was something else entirely. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a collapse of boundaries I never even thought could break. A 36-year-old woman, my wife, entangled with a 16-year-old boy. And not just any boy. The boy who had eaten at our table 100 times, slept in my son's room during sleepovers, laughed at our family vacations I wanted to vomit. Dylan was still shouting when I grabbed the phone. His words blurred together, a mess of anger and pain, but I knew what they meant. He had discovered it before me. He had put it together. My son had carried that knowledge, probably for weeks, maybe months, while I remained clueless. The thought of him carrying that burden, of him seeing his own mother in that way, was almost worse than the affair itself. Claire tried to speak then. Not to apologize, not to admit. Her voice was low, shaky, like she was rehearsing excuses in real time. But I couldn't process any of it. All I felt was a deep, suffocating pressure in my chest. My family, the life I built, was crumbling right there in the kitchen, and there was no way to stop it. That night blurred. I know I yelled at her eventually, words I don't even remember forming. I know Dylan stormed upstairs and slammed his door. I know Claire cried, though it sounded more like panic than remorse. I barely slept. I sat in the dark living room, staring at nothing, while my heart raced like I was about to die. The next morning, the house felt different. Quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful, but heavy. Dylan didn't come down for breakfast. Claire stayed in the bedroom. I left for work but didn't make it past the gas station before pulling over, gripping the steering wheel until my hands hurt. I couldn't function. I couldn't even breathe normally. Over the next few days, the details started coming out, piece by piece. Not from Claire. She was locked in a cycle of denial, deflection, and half-truths, but from Dylan. He was the one who told me how it started. Small, subtle things, late-night conversations between them, jokes that crossed lines, messages that felt too personal. He hadn't thought much of it at first, because kids don't assume adults will betray them like that. But then it escalated, and suddenly his best friend wasn't just hanging out for video games and pizza. He was sneaking off to text my wife, meeting her outside of school, becoming part of something twisted. The worst part wasn't even that Claire had destroyed our marriage. The worst part was what she had done to Dylan. She had poisoned his friendships, shattered his ability to trust, and forced him into the role of witness to something no child should ever see. I could see it in his face, the confusion, the guilt. That wasn't his to carry, the way he avoided even looking at her. My son wasn't just angry. He was broken, and I didn't know how to fix him. For years, I thought my job as a father was to provide money, food, a roof, guidance. I thought if I showed up, if I stayed, if I love him, that would be enough. But in that moment I realized the real job was harder, to protect him not just from the world, but from the people closest to him when they turned dangerous. That included his own mother. I started sleeping on the couch. I couldn't share a bed with Claire anymore. We spoke only when necessary, and even then, every word felt poisonous. She still refused to accept the gravity of what she had done. She framed it as a mistake, as if that word could shrink the damage into something manageable. But there was no managing this. There was only fallout. The house became a battlefield of silences. Dylan barely left his room, and when he did, he walked past his mother like she was a stranger. I tried to talk to him, but I didn't know what to say. How do you explain something like this? How do you make a kid feel safe when the betrayal came from the one person who should have been his safest place? I knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The days after the discovery felt like living inside a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Each morning I opened my eyes and, for a split second, thought maybe it hadn't been real. Maybe the scene in the kitchen, the phone, the messages, maybe. I had imagined it. But then the silence of the house reminded me. Dylan's closed door. Claire moving like a ghost through the rooms. My chest tightening before I even swung my feet off the bed. I told myself I needed to act, to take control, but the truth was I had no idea what to do. This wasn't a fight you could settle with apologies or counseling. This was something darker. My wife had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and my son was caught in the wreckage. The first real step came when I realized I couldn't ignore the boy, Dylan's best friend, the other half of this. I don't even want to write his name. Seeing it makes me sick. He had been in my house so many times. I had treated him like family. And while I was cooking burgers on the grill or driving them to basketball practice, he had been texting my wife under the table, slipping into a role that destroyed everything that I wrestled with whether to confront him directly. A part of me wanted to drive to his parents' house, pound on the door, and drag him out onto the lawn. But what good would that do? He was 16. A kid, technically, even if he was old enough to know better. The real responsibility was on Claire. She was the adult. She was supposed to know the line, to protect my son and his friends, not exploit them. But ignoring him wasn't an option either. Dylan still had to see him at school. Imagine being 16, walking into the hallway every day, and knowing your best friend is sleeping with your mother. It made me want to vomit just thinking about it that I decided I had to tell his parents. It wasn't just about Dylan anymore. That boy's family deserved to know what was happening under their noses. I typed out the message 3 times before hitting send, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The response came within minutes: confusion, disbelief, then rage. They asked if I was sure, if I had proof. I forwarded the screenshots Dylan had saved. After that, silence. That night, their car pulled into our driveway. His father came to the door, face red, eyes blazing. For a second, I thought he might hit me, but all he said was, "Is she here?" I didn't stop him when he pushed past me. He went straight to the kitchen, where Claire was sitting. The sound of his voice yelling at her was something I'll never forget. It was a father's fury, not at his son, though I'm sure that came later, but at the adult who had pulled him into something so destructive. After they left, Claire locked herself in the bedroom and didn't come out for hours. Dylan didn't ask what had happened. He didn't have to. He already knew enough. From there, the fallout grew bigger. The boy stopped coming to school for a week. Rumors spread anyway. Teenagers are ruthless when they catch a whiff of scandal. Dylan became a target of whispers, sideways glances, laughter that wasn't about him but still felt like it. I could see the weight of it pressing on him. He withdrew further, shutting himself off from friends, from me, from everything that I tried. To reach him, sitting outside his door, telling him he wasn't alone, that none of this was his fault. Sometimes he would listen in silence. Sometimes I heard muffled crying. But he rarely opened the door. My son, who used to light up when I asked if he wanted to shoot hoops or grab a burger, was disappearing in front of me. And the cruelest part was that I couldn't protect him, because the wound came from inside our own house. Meanwhile, Claire seemed caught between 2 realities. On one hand, she begged me not to tell anyone else, as if keeping the secret could make it go away. On the other, she spoke about it in terms that chilled me. It just happened. He was mature for his age. You don't understand. It wasn't like that. The more she talked, the more I realized she hadn't fully grasped the horror of what she'd done. She wasn't just unfaithful. She had groomed a teenager, and in doing so, she had burned our family to ash. I began speaking with a lawyer. At first, it was just to understand what my options were. But the moment I sat across from her desk and explained, in broken sentences, what had happened, I knew divorce wasn't optional anymore. There was no salvaging this. There was only survival, for me and, most importantly, for Dylan. What haunted me most was the look in my son's eyes when he finally did speak to me, days later. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just looked hollow, as if part of him had been scraped out and wouldn't grow back. I knew then that this story wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about whether I could help my son find his way back from a betrayal that no child should ever have to endure, and I honestly didn't know if I could. Filing for divorce felt surreal. Walking into the lawyer's office, handing over documents, hearing phrases like custody arrangement and marital assets, it all sounded sterile, bureaucratic. But underneath those words was the collapse of the life I had built over more than a decade. That I signed papers with a hand that didn't feel like mine. The woman sitting across from me, professional and calm, couldn't begin to understand the weight behind each signature. This wasn't about property division. This wasn't about who got the car or the furniture. It was about the fact that my wife had destroyed the foundation of our family, and I was left standing in the ruins with our son. I thought the hardest part would be ending my marriage. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching Dylan struggle. He was slipping through my fingers. His grades collapsed almost overnight. Teachers called me to say he stopped turning in assignments, that he was distracted, angry, isolated. He quit the basketball team. His best friend was gone, not just as a friend but as a symbol of betrayal he couldn't escape. Every corner of his life was contaminated by what had happened. T home. He drifted like a ghost. Some nights I'd hear him pacing in his room. Other nights, silence that felt even worse. I tried everything, cooking his favorite meals, offering to take him anywhere he wanted, sitting quietly just to be near him. But nothing reached him. The bond we once had, father and son joking over dinner, competing on the basketball court, sharing stupid YouTube videos, had been eclipsed by a darkness I couldn't lift. I knew he blamed me, at least partly. Not because I had done anything, but because I hadn't stopped it. Because I hadn't seen it. He must have thought, how could Dad not notice? How could he let this happen under his own roof? The shame ate at me. I replayed every sign I had. Ignored Claire's late nights, her obsession with Dylan's phone, her strange protectiveness. I had chalked it up to stress, to marriage fatigue, to anything but the truth. And now my son was paying the price for my blindness. Claire, meanwhile, tried to salvage her image. She told me we could work through this, that what happened was a mistake she regretted, that Dylan would heal with time. I listened to those words and felt nothing but rage. She still didn't get it. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was predatory, and she wanted to minimize it because facing the reality was unbearable. I cut off most communication with her except what was absolutely necessary for the divorce process. Even then, every text, every phone call left me shaking. With anger. She was still living in the house during those weeks, sleeping in the bedroom we had once shared, and the air itself felt toxic. Dylan avoided her completely, which meant he spent most of his time locked in his room. The silence between them was louder than any shouting could have been. When the news finally reached extended family, the fallout spread further. My parents were devastated. Her parents tried to defend her at first, denial, disbelief, but once they saw the evidence, they went quiet. A few friends cut us off entirely, not knowing what to say. Others offered sympathy, but even their words felt hollow. No one knew how to handle a situation like this. It wasn't just infidelity. It was something that made people recoil, even to imagine. There was one night, maybe 3 weeks after it all broke open, that I hit bottom. Dylan hadn't left his room all day. I knocked, no answer. I pushed the door open and found him sitting on the floor, staring at nothing, his phone on the carpet beside him. He didn't look up when I came in. He just whispered, "I don't want to be here anymore." My chest caved in. It was the worst thing I'd ever heard. I knelt down, put my hand on his shoulder, and begged him to talk. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just sat there, hollow, like he was already gone. That night I called a therapist. Not for me, for him. I didn't care about the cost, the wait list, anything. I knew if I didn't get him help, I might lose him. Therapy was a turning point, though a painful one. Dylan resisted at first, barely speaking during sessions. But slowly, over weeks, he began to open up. He talked about the betrayal, about how disgusting it felt, about the anger he carried toward his mother and his best friend. He admitted he felt ashamed, even though he had nothing to be ashamed of. The therapist reassured him, but it was a long process. Healing doesn't happen in a neat arc. It's messy, full of setbacks and small victories. For me, therapy meant sitting in the waiting room with too much time to think. About how my marriage had ended. About how my son's innocence had been stolen. About whether I was strong enough to guide him through this. I didn't feel strong. I felt like a man who had failed at the most important job he ever had, and yet, sitting there, I realized there was no alternative. I couldn't undo what had been done. I couldn't erase the messages, the nights, the betrayal. All I could do was stay, keep showing up, keep fighting for my son. The divorce papers moved forward. Custody would be decided soon. Claire wanted joint custody, which made my blood boil. The idea that she still believed she had the right to parent after what she had done was almost unbearable. But the court doesn't always see things the way you do. I braced myself for a fight, not just legal, but moral, a fight for my son's safety, his future, his ability to trust again, and in the middle of it all, I kept waking up in the night, staring at the ceiling, asking myself the same question over and over. How do you rebuild a family after the person who was supposed to protect it becomes the one who destroyed it? The legal process was exhausting in a way I hadn't expected. I thought the emotional collapse of my marriage would be the hardest part, but the court system had its own way of grinding a person down. Every form, every affidavit, every meeting with lawyers forced me to relive details I wanted to forget. It wasn't just about divorce anymore. It was about protecting Dylan, and that meant putting everything on record. My lawyer was blunt. You have a strong case for sole custody. But the court doesn't always rule the way we think it should. Be prepared for resistance. Hearing that made my stomach knot. The idea that Claire could still have access, unsupervised, after what she had done, felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. When the custody hearings began, the courtroom felt colder than I imagined. Claire sat a few feet away, dressed neatly, her hair tied back, trying to look like a stable, responsible mother. I couldn't reconcile that image with the woman who had sent late-night "I love you" messages to a teenager. She spoke softly to her lawyer, avoided my eyes, but every time she glanced at Dylan sitting beside me, I saw a flicker of something. Maybe shame, maybe desperation, maybe denial. The judge asked questions that made me want to scream. Could Claire provide a stable home environment? Did Dylan have a meaningful relationship with both parents? Was there evidence of harm? Harm. As if what she had done needed further proof to count. I wanted to shout that the harm was standing right there, a 16-year-old boy whose trust in his mother had been obliterated. Dylan himself was called in for a private interview with the judge. That terrified me. I didn't want him to be forced into the role of choosing sides, but in a way, he already had. When he came out afterward, pale and quiet, I wanted to hug him but didn't, because he looked like he couldn't handle being touched. Later, my lawyer told me he had been clear. He didn't feel safe with her, he didn't want to live with her, he wanted to stay with me. Hearing that broke me and healed me all at once. I hated that he had to say those words, but I was proud of him for speaking the truth. The court ultimately ruled in my favor. Sole custody. Claire was granted supervised visitation, limited and controlled. When the judge said the words, I felt relief crash over me so hard I almost cried right there in the courtroom. But it wasn't triumph. There was nothing victorious about it. It was survival. Bare minimum. Claire's reaction was a mix of shock and fury. She glared at me as if I had stolen something from her. In reality, she had stolen from herself. She had chosen this path, and now she was paying for it. Still, the bitterness in her face made me realize she would never fully accept what she had done. She would always find ways to twist the story, to minimize, to blame. That was her burden now, not mine. Once custody was settled, the house shifted. For the first time, I could breathe without the constant dread of her walking through the door. I moved her things out, rearranged the furniture, even painted the living room a different color. It wasn't about decoration. It was about reclaiming the space. I needed to strip the house of her shadow so Dylan and I could begin again. But the hardest work wasn't legal or material. It was emotional. Dylan carried his scars everywhere he went. He didn't laugh the way he used to. He didn't bring friends home anymore. Even when he started to open up in therapy, I could tell he was still guarded with me, as if he wasn't sure how much he could trust anyone. And I couldn't blame him. When the person you trust most betrays you, the world becomes dangerous. In every direction that I tried to create new routines. Saturday mornings we'd go for breakfast at a diner. Evenings we'd walk the dog together. Small rituals, steady and predictable, to show him that some things wouldn't collapse beneath his feet. Sometimes he responded. Sometimes he kept his headphones in and drifted in silence. I learned to be patient, to accept that healing doesn't follow my timeline. Meanwhile, whispers about Claire spread through our community. Parents at school exchanged looks. Some were disgusted, others were morbidly curious. I hated the gossip, but I couldn't stop it. What she had done wasn't just private, it was a story people couldn't look away from. Dylan felt it there. Most kids at school talked. Some mocked him, others avoided him. He went from being just another student to being the kid whose mom. I saw how it hardened him, but also how it isolated him further. I wanted to take him away, move to another town, start fresh. But life doesn't make clean escapes that easy. Jobs, finances, custody agreements, they all kept us tied to the same place, at least for now. So instead, I focused on carving out little safe spaces within the chaos. His room, therapy sessions, our Saturday breakfasts, small pieces of stability. One night, months after the court ruling, I found myself staring at an old family photo tucked in a drawer. The three of us on a beach, sunburned and smiling, Dylan only about 10 years old, Claire holding his hand. It felt like a picture of strangers. I realized then that the family I thought I had was gone long before I knew it. Maybe Claire had been drifting away for years, hiding her choices in plain sight. Maybe I had been blind, unwilling to see the cracks. Either way, that chapter was over. What remained was me and Dylan. Two survivors of the same disaster, trying to build something new out of the ashes. I didn't know if we would ever feel whole again, but I knew I wasn't going to let him face it alone. Time didn't erase what happened, but it reshaped it. Months turned into a year, and the chaos that once filled every corner of our lives slowly settled into something quieter. The pain never vanished, but it dulled into a scar rather than an open wound. Dylan was still different. He grew harder around the edges, more cautious, less trusting. But there were glimpses of the boy I used to know. He laughed sometimes, real laughter that caught me off guard. He began to make new friends, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. Therapy helped, though the progress was uneven. There were still nights he shut himself away, but there were also days he'd ask me to shoot hoops again, or drive him somewhere just to hang out. Those moments felt like lifelines. As for Claire, she drifted into the background of our lives. Supervised visits were few, and Dylan rarely agreed to them. When he did, he came back quiet, detached, and I stopped pushing. It became clear that he didn't owe her his presence. Their relationship, once the anchor of his childhood, had turned into something fractured beyond repair. I couldn't fix that for him. No one could. I focused on what I could control. Work, home, small routines with my son. Rebuilding wasn't about some grand gesture. It was about consistency. Showing him that I was still here, still dependable, even when everything else had fallen apart. Sometimes people ask me if I hate her. The truth is complicated. There are days when the rage still burns hot, when I think about what she did and I feel sick. But there are also days when I don't feel anything at all. She made her choices. She destroyed her marriage, her family, her reputation. The weight of that is hers to carry now. What I've learned is that survival doesn't look like victory. There was no moment where everything suddenly felt better. But there were moments where it felt possible to move forward, and that was enough. The family I thought I had is gone. But what remains, me and my son, scarred but still standing, is worth fighting for. And that's exactly what I'll keep doing.